an honor for me to be introducing him. At first, Professor Bandyopadhyay, of course, really does not require any introduction because every student in India, remote or in a main university, will have read Plasi to Partition. In fact, the name of the book goes by the name Bandyopadhyay. And so, from the undergraduate students, we are all very familiar with Sir's work. Among his own peer group and the researchers, there is very innovative research which has been done by Professor Bandyopadhyay, and it would be, in this brief introduction, difficult to flag those off, but I would just still like to point out two very important things which I as a reader found in Sir's work. The first being caste, culture and hegemony, social domination in colonial Bengal. This book was very innovative at its time, and in fact gave a lot of guidance to later historians to work on because of two things. One, that at a time when it was all about discussion of high politics and partition, for the first time, Professor Bandyopadhyay brought in the aspect of caste as well, the aspect of the Namashudra community and their understanding of partition and their possible role or their agency in the politics of partition. Even another innovative thing was, whereas caste is a very commonplace in the discussions in rest of India, to bring it across for the region of Bengal was a very, very innovative contribution. His next work, Decolonization in South Asia, is another very innovative work in terms of the theme that it addresses for the first time, discussing decolonization from the South Asian perspective, not just partition and India. But what I take away from that book is also because he has expanded the area, the time period in which a historian actually works. A very important line in that book was, where historians end at 1947, civics and political scientists take over 1950-52. It's the in-between period, 47 to 50, in Indian history that we really is almost orphaned. And for the first time, an intervention was made to look into this period as well. And today we have, it's very fashionable to talk of the long partition and discuss about post-partition. But I think that innovative break was given by Professor Bandyopadhyay. Of course, there are many more works to his credit, and today what he's going to speak on is also, again, we look forward to the innovations that will be coming up, pioneering works in that. Does Bengal and what is the caste issue and historiographical exploration in that. With that, I pass on to Professor Bandyopadhyay to take over from here. Welcome, sir, to AUD.
Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty, for the one very generous introduction. And thank you, Professor Kodhyal, for inviting me to speak in your seminar series. As I was mentioning before we all began, that if we can identify one positive side of COVID, it's the webinar, which can, in a kind of virtual world, bring together scholars from different parts of the world. And it gives me great pleasure to be here this morning for you and evening for me. As for my presentation here in this webinar, some of you have already possibly identified that the opening question in the title of my presentation, "Did caste mysteriously disappear from Bengal?" comes from the title of a book chapter which the famous political scientist Partha Chatterjee wrote in 2016. Now, this book chapter was written in the context of a very popular perception shared by many scholars, politicians, and definitely by the elite Bengali Bhadralok at one time, that caste did not matter in Bengal. And Chatterjee argues in this chapter that it's a myth which has been created by the fact that caste was weakened by the social and political changes that were brought in or brought as a result of partition. And as a result of that, there is this myth that caste does not work, but it did. I will put this question in a slightly broader context, My argument in this presentation will be this, that there is now a very large amount of literature which deal with the development of caste as an institution in the Bengal Delta. And in view of that significant amount of literature, there is absolutely no point in arguing that their caste does not matter in Bengal. It did, at least from the 10th, 11th centuries onwards. And I will also argue that, as in any other part of India, caste did occur in historical period and does work still today as a system of asymmetric relationship of power, privilege, and entitlement in the Bengali society. What I'll try to do, I'll make a broad survey of this literature and kind of try to argue how um, this institution developed and got itself entrenched. And I will give a slightly different interpretation of what Professor Chatterjee refers to as the mysterious disappearance. My argument will be that it did not disappear. There was, and the caste did kind of exist even after partition, although the protest against the caste discrimination or caste inequities took a different form. And we have to identify those different forms in order to understand this transformation of caste protest into something else. So there was, in other words, there was absence of protest against caste discrimination, but there was no absence of caste itself. So I will, in the end, offer a slightly different kind of explanation for this mystery, so-called, about the disappearance of caste. Going into the literature, and we all know by now that the first systematic study of caste as an institution, social institution in India and in Bengal in particular, started with the colonial ethnographers and census commissioners who collected a significant amount of ethnological information about this institution at a very minute level. And they collated that information to construct what anthropologist Bernard Cohn would call a discourse of differentiation. That how differentiated the Hindu society or the Indian society as such was around the 19th century or early 20th century when these ethnographical studies were being done. Around the same time, number of Bengali intellectuals were also studying caste, and of them, one significant name was that of Jogendranath Bhattacharya, who wrote in 1896 a treatise called The Hindu Castes and Sects. And as you can, if you look at the date, it was coming out about 5 years after Herbert Risley's Tribes and Castes of Bengal. So it was I think I see it as a kind of response to Herbert Risley. For what Bhattacharya argues is this: he's a Brahmin, he was a president of the Brahmin Association of Bengal. What he's arguing, this I'm quoting, "I'm no out and out admirer of caste. Its discipline might be relaxed in certain directions with advantage, but at the same time," he argues, "generally speaking, there does not exist any antipathy between the several castes which the world at large has been led to believe," unquote. In other words, Bhattacharya is kind of ignoring the asymmetric relations of power and privilege that were embedded in the caste hierarchy, and creating a position which was later universalized by the nationalist discourse, and several other intellectuals around that time kind of echoed this kind of construction and this kind of understanding of the caste system, and civil reformers reflected the same understanding. And my feeling is this is a kind of understanding which later on evolves in the Gandhian nationalist position on caste, that there were certain objectionable aspect of caste like untouchability, but the system as a whole was not that kind of antagonistic as the Western observers had made it out to be. I'll come to that point later on, but that was the kind of understanding of caste system around the late 19th, early 20th centuries. But after independence, in fact, soon after independence, that all changed when Nihar Ranjan Rai wrote the seminal book in 1949, which was called, it was written in Bengali, it's called Bangalir Itihash Adi Porbo, or the history of the Bengali speaking people, where Ray showed with empirical evidence that it was around, I mean, first of all, Ray argues, somewhat reflecting the nationalist position, that the rigors of caste were comparatively weak in Bengal because of certain historical factors like late Aryanization of the region, ascendancy of Buddhism, and constant interaction with a more liberal tribal culture, and so on. But at the same time, Ray showed that the dominance of Brahmanism could be clearly observed from the Sino-Burman period in Bengal, that was between the 11th and the 13th centuries, when the divisions of society, particularly based on the Varna system, the four Varna divisions, were more and more becoming rigidly constructed, and the social interactions were becoming more and more conservative under the influence of the conservative Sritikaras of that period. This is a kind of finding which was further sophisticated by Kunal Chakraborty, who looks at the Puranas of this period, and he identifies 12th century as the crucial period when, under the patronage of the Sena kings, that Brahmanism got firmly entrenched in Bengal. And Chakraborty argued with absolute total significant amount of empirical evidence that what he says, I quote him, institutionalize of the Brahminical principle of social organization, the caste hierarchy, unquote, could be seen from around this period or 12th century. So it was around the 12th century that caste as an institution was very much in existence in Bengali society, and it was evolving. The other seminal study which kind of reaffirmed this finding of the scholars was by Kumkum Chatterjee. Now, while Chakraborty was studying the Puranas, Kumkum Chatterjee studied another set of documents, which were the Kula Granthas or Kula Panjikas, which were scripted over a long period between 9th and 10th centuries, and where she argues that it was during this Sena period particularly, and she identifies three Sena kings, the Adishura, Ballal Sen, and Lakshman Sen, who were primarily responsible for entrenching this hierarchical social system in Bengali society. They introduced Kulinism as a further layer in the hierarchy. And the Kula Granthas also kind of showed their strategies and the measures which they deployed to withstand the ideological challenges, which Nihar Rai mentioned, the ideological challenges of Buddhism or Tantrism or Islam, and finally in the 18th century of Gauriya Vaishnavism, which were kind of questioning the hierarchy of caste in Bengali society. The other development which came out also through these works is that the evolving relationship between caste and the economic system. Nihar Ranjan Rai, first of all, showed a correlation between caste economy and power, and the status, which he argued was gradually being established in the Bengal region from the Gupta period, that is between 4th and 5th centuries in the Christian era, where he argues that there was a gradual correlation between the higher status for those who did not do any manual work, whereas those who did manual work were going down in social ranking and in social status. And as the agricultural economy expanded, this process of labor kind of came to kind of determine the social relationship and establishing a relationship between the class and caste in Bengali society. This was a situation which was this was a kind of finding which was further developed by Hitesh Ranjan Sannal in another significant book in 1981, where he developed the idea of what he called, I quote, jati based economic system, where he showed that it was during this period that that occupations became hereditary and became associated with particular jatis or subcastes, in the sense that it created what he called a non-competitive economy, where no one was allowed to change occupation. In this system, everyone produced and exchanged goods and services according to their capabilities and needs. And following a very Gandhian nationalist framework, Sanyal also argued that it created an economy of what he called interdependence and cooperation, which ensured minimum security for all. In conclusion, in conditions of scarcity, which he argued existed in India from about 7th century in the Christian era, this suited everyone, particularly those at the bottom layer of society, because they had a minimum guarantee of security under this system. My critique of this whole historical literature is that what Sannal and others overlooks is that this overlooks is the evolving relationship of power, and which was excluding the people in the bottom of the society from any right to own property and making their access to the promised minimum security conditional on following the rules of caste. In other words, one has to accept that this acceptance of the so called non competitive economy was through social coercion and not by consent. And it was meant to entrench the positions of the privileged upper caste people, landlords, and it was not entirely as landlords. But Sannal, to be fair to him, also brings in a rider into this discussion. He argues that it was not a static society as such, which the study of literature would kind of suggest. But from the 13th century onwards, there were new opportunities which were coming up for upward social mobility, where the lower ranking Satshudra jatis and Navashak jatis could improve their social status. However, he also mentions there were significant constraints, quote unquote, that remain to make upward social mobility extremely difficult, if not totally impossible, for the peasants and artisan castes belonging to the lowest Antvaja or lowborn and auspicious or untouchable jatis. This is a kind of situation which was further elaborated and explained by another scholar, Ronald Linden, first in an article and later on in his book, and he showed that how this caste discipline and this correlation between between power and economic resources and status was maintained by the local regional kings, and under the regional kings by the zamindars, who ruled with the advice of the Brahmin Pandits and who enforced the discipline by discipline which Indian calls Jati Dharma, by using what Indian calls danda or coercive power. In other words, in the pre-colonial period, the literature now very clearly shows how the system operated as an asymmetric relationship of power and how the discipline was maintained through coercive methods. Then what happens after the colonial rule comes in? Here I can refer to another significant study by S.N. Mukherjee, who showed that this system operated almost unchanged during the early colonial period, when the colonial government did not interfere in the day-to-day and life of their subjects, and particularly did not kind of disturb the social disciplines maintained by caste, and caste kacharis and samajas continued to operate under the tutelage of the local zamindars. And this institution now operated under what he called the dal. Dal could be translated as faction, but it was more than a faction. These were multi-caste groups which were operated and controlled by a Dalapati or a leader who was located in the colonial metropolis of Calcutta. But his influence spread over the whole region into the rural areas, and he kind of maintained social disciplines of caste, also maintained the disciplines of marriage relationship, which was the linchpin of caste relationship or caste status, and so on. And John McGuire, who's also another significant scholar in this field, shows that this kind of system, the dull system, enforcing caste disciplines in Bengali Hindu society, continued until the late 19th, early 20th centuries, when the development of capitalism kind of weakens the bonds of caste to a large extent. And the other reason why this system was kind of weakened was the coming of the modern colonial reform movements, like introduction of education, in opening up of the professions, land reforms, where land becomes a marketable commodity which anyone could buy. And these changes obviously brought in some changes in the caste structure, which in 1949, right after the independence, anthropologist Nirmal Kumar Bose showed in a seminal book in 1949, which was also published initially in Bengali. It was called the Hindu Samajir Goron, where he showed that these reforms introduced, in a very nationalist tone, he argued that these reforms introduced competition and conflict in a society that was previously built on the principle of interdependence and cooperation. Now, we know that we already know that I've argued that interdependence and cooperation is not something which we can sustain with evidence, but nevertheless, he thought that this brought in extra competition and conflict, and that was the major aspect of the reform movements that came during the colonial period. But he also mentioned that the changes brought in were of a very limited nature, and they could not fundamentally alter the prevalent structures of privilege or exclusion. And this has been showed by another sociologist in a significant detailed study of the land structure and land ownership in Bengal, Ramkrishna Mukherjee, and where he shows with empirical evidence that the old caste structure very neatly fitted into the new landed elite structure which evolved under the land reforms of the colonial government. He identified three classes of new landowners and new privileged classes of the colonial period, and shows how the pre-colonial elite groups of different hierarchical status levels fitted into those three categories and kind of adjusted themselves to modernity and continued their privilege and entitlement. But at the same time, all these historians and social scientists also show that there was limited amount of social mobility which were taking place in society. Hitesh Sannal made three case studies, the Tilis, Shodgobs, and the Mahishos. All these were middle-ranking trading or agrarian castes who were taking advantage of the new opportunities thrown up by the colonial rule and were moving up in the social scale, and later on legitimizing their new position through such symbolic religious functions as temple building and patronage for the Brahmins and so on. And this was also happening among the tribal groups. Surajit Sinha, for example, studied the Bhumij Khatriyas of Purulia Singhbhum districts, where he also shows that there was an acculturation process, a kind of Hinduization, but which was not very complete. He argues that despite this acculturation or Hinduization, certain liberal tribal cultural traits still remained in their behavior patterns, and this created problems for their integration into the broader mainstream society as well. But all these changes happening, one other aspect which is coming up during this period and which has been studied by a number of historians, that is the emergence of a new high caste elite group who have been called and now it's universally accepted, the term of Bhadralok. Bhadralok was a new elite group which was coming up in collaboration with the colonial rule. But what is very significant, as John Maguire in a very quantitative studies showed, that the Bhadralok in the late 18th century belonged to as many as 18 castes. But the majority of them belonged to three upper castes, which were Brahmin, caste, and Boito. And these were the three traditional upper castes of Bengali society, and they constituted the majority of this new powerful elite group of Bhadralok, who were collaborating with the British, and were later on expanding their influence and power to the new areas of education and profession, and later on access to political power, and so on. So this group had entrenched position in the society. There was possibility of a non or a lower caste person to become a Bhadralok, to enter the charmed circle of the Bhadralok. But the scholars like Broomfield have argued, and I can quote, it was difficult to enter the charmed circle of the respectable for the lower castes because there were formidable difficulties to overcome. And I will come to these difficulties later on, because what we find in the Bhadralok culture of this period, first of all, there were social reforms among the Bhadralok. The Bhadralok were westernized, liberal, social, and later on political elite, and they were interested in social reforms. But at the same time, they tried to safeguard their exclusive social and political power. For example, the Brahma movement, which was the most liberal of the social reform movements, Brahma movement was always ambivalent about the caste question. It did not openly, in such a way, kind of condemn the caste system as such. And Sumit Sarkar, in a very significant article, has shown that the Bhadralok Hindus, the middle class Hindus, firmly kind of perpetuated the system by the concept of what he called the Adhikari Bheda. Adhikari Bheda he defined as discourse of inevitable and justifiable inequality. That every caste has their own right, and that is very natural. That is acceptable, and that was the kind of concept which justified the unequal distribution of privilege and entitlement in society. In other words, what I found I argued in my 2004 book, which Pallavi was referring to, is the contradiction and ambivalence of Bengali modernity in the 19th and early 20th century. Where is the contradiction and ambivalence? On the one hand, all the Bengali elite reformers and social leaders believed that untouchability was condemnable, and they wanted untouchability to go. But at the same time, they accepted caste system as a normative system, determining their social rituals, religious rituals, and also markers of their status in society. So in other words, untouchability had to go, but caste system was good, and it was a non-competitive system which the nationalist discourse wanted to universalize, and the Bengali Bhadralok very much purchased that thing. And what is also significant, some of the lower castes wanted to be socially mobile around this time. They emulated some of these behaviors from the elite Bhadralok community. But as a result of that, what happened, there was also conservative impacts on their own society, because Bhadralok society was also a very patriarchal society. So many of the lower caste associations emulated all those patriarchal kind of rituals and customs from the elite society. And as a result, women in these groups began to lose their freedom and their rights. Now, what needs to be remembered, that until the 1990s, all these studies on the Bengali caste system were kind of looking at the system from above. That is, from the perspective of the elite Bhadralok Bengali society. And when you look at the system from above, it will look less problematic and less complicated. And I have argued elsewhere that if you ask a Bengali whether caste does work in Bengal, if the person is a high caste person, he'll obviously say that no, caste is not a problem. But if you ask that same question to a member of the scheduled caste or scheduled tribes or OBC, the answer will be different, because they who suffer, who they experience the absence of uh, rights and privilege on a daily basis. So, in other words, it was being looked until the 1990s, it was being looked from above, and it was kind of found to be less problematic. But it was found to be more and more problematic as historians began to shed light on the bottom levels of the society, how the Dalit movements began to develop in Bengal. Now, I can say that when I started research in the mid 1980s, I had no idea that the Namashudras of Bengal had organized such a powerful social and later on political movement in East Bengal, and how it's profoundly affected Bengal politics in the crucial years of the 1940s. And this would not happen if I had not accidentally stumbled onto piles of documents on this movement in the archives. So I would think it was only in an article in 1989 that Partha Chatterjee, The Caste and the Subalterns, Partha Chatterjee has provided, had indicated the possibility of resistance and the questioning of the Hindu dominance, Hindu ideological religious dominance from the bottom up. He studied certain religious sects like the Balaharis or the Balarami Sampradaya, which was led by a Hari or a low caste leader who imagined an inversion of the caste hierarchy, where Brahmins would be at the bottom and the Haris, of which was otherwise the lowest caste, would be at the top. So, and he showed also that ultimately such religious sects, although they challenged the dominant ideology, they could not alter the system. And so this negativity was ultimately defeated without affecting any fundamental social change. But what I found in the Namashudra movement, that these movements can also bring in very significant social change and particularly challenge the authority of the Bhadralok in a very significant way. And there were many such religious sects like the Sahib Dhoni, Karta Bhaja, Balok Dasi, and one such sect around in the same family was the Motua sect, which was developing among the Namashudras. And it was around this Motua sect, which is now known as the Motua Mahasangha, very much active in Bengal politics, that the Namashudra movement began to develop. This movement is important because all the other historians of nationalist movement in Bengal, from Anil Seal, Broomfield on the one side, Sumit Sarkar and Rajat Rai and so on, all those historians who have looked at nationalist movement in Bengal have identified that the Namashudras, who were the largest peasant caste in eastern Bengal, did not participate in the nationalist movement. So the question is why they did not participate in the nationalist movement, and if they did not, what they were thinking, what they were doing. So what happened is this: it was around this Motua community, Motua sect, that the Namashudra movement was developing, and eventually, by the 1940s, it became a real power within the West Bengal, within the Bengal Legislative Assembly, and they had an alliance with the Muslim League. And because of this alliance after the 1937 election, that Congress was deprived of the opportunity of forming a government. Their only chance to get into power after 1937 election was kind of destroyed by this alliance between the Muslim and the Dalit organizations. But unfortunately, the Namashudra movement did not remain united under the pressure of partition politics. In 1946, while one section of the Namashudra movement joined the Congress because partition was coming and they were living in the Muslim majority areas of East Bengal, another section led by a very significant leader, Jogendranath Mandal, who joined Ambedkar's Scheduled Caste Federation, and he founded the Bengal branch of the federation in 1943 and started the Ambedkarite movement in Bengal around this time. But the net result of this was, while the Ambedkarite movement started, it was initially very powerful, but this also divided the scheduled caste movement in Bengal in 1946 into two kind of almost warring camps, if not just divided groups. The other group, which have also been participating actively in this Dalit politics from the bottom up, were the Rajbongshis of North Bengal. Their origin is from a tribal group of Koch who were being Hinduized and were taking up. Koch was kind of being transformed into Rajbongshi through their Kshatriyaization movement. They called themselves Kshatriyas. They formed a new organization called Kshatriya Samiti. And through Kshatriya Samiti, they all began to organize this movement. And the Kshatriya Samiti later on became an ally of Ambedkar's Scheduled Caste Federation after 1946 in the 1946 election. But what is also unfortunate that the Kshatriya movement of the Rajbongshis also was divided when the communist-led Tevhaga movement starts in 1946 in the North Bengal districts, when the Rajbongshi Jotdars, or the large landholders, and the Rajbongshi Adhyars, or the sharecroppers, began to fight each other. And the Kshatriya Samiti wanted to stop this fighting, but that never happened. In other words, the caste solidarity that was coming up and protesting against caste disprivilege or inequalities were kind of divided along class lines. So this brings me to the more theoretical issues. How do the commonalities between these movements? There were other minor movements like the Pondra movements in South Bengal, like the Bhuimali movement in East Bengal, and the Malos in Eastern Bengal, and so on. But what are the common features and the common trends in all these movements? Sumit Sarkar has written a very significant article, Identities and Histories, in which he has argued that all these movements kind of challenge very significantly the dominance of the upper caste Bhadralok in Bengali society. They showed that challenging this dominance was possible, and to some extent the challenges were significant. But at the same time, and this is also my own finding, he warns us that we need not romanticize the solidarities, and we should also interrogate the essentialism of identities. In other words, these movements were not simple conflicts of culture between the upper caste educated elites and the Dalit counter elites. For the latter did not enjoy anything like complete cultural autonomy, nor were these castes perfectly homogeneous entities. We need to introduce class into any discussion of caste and should look for not only what this movement stood for, we should also take note of their silences and disjunctions, for they indicate possibilities of fissures that often weaken these movements. In other words, what I also found in my own study, these movements and these groups, the caste groups, were extremely heterogeneous in character. So in other words, we have to take into consideration this factor of heterogeneity while understanding this Dalit protest against caste dominance of the Bhadralok. Now, what about the puzzle? I mean, when we come to the time of partition, caste was very much a potent factor in Bengal society as well as in Bengal politics. So Chatterjee argues in his article that partition consolidated the power of the Hindu Bhadralok in West Bengal, as they would never be reduced to a minority position ever again. It also precluded possibility of Dalit and Muslims united against them, as they did in 1937 in colonial Bengal to contain their power. But we need to remember, however, that what disappeared in post-partition West Bengal was not caste, but any articulate protest against caste discrimination, which was so prominent in the late colonial period in Bengal. While this was true, because of total, what Chatterjee argued, because of the very significant hold on to power by the upper caste Bhadralok, another scholar, Lama Rewal, has shown that in post-independence West Bengal, political power remained concentrated in the hands of the upper caste elite to the almost total exclusion of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. There were reserved seats, but there were very few in the top echelons of leadership of the political party or in the cabinet positions. They had a cabinet chair. And but my argument is this lack of articulate caste protest in West Bengal was because of some other different historical factors. If we look at the colonial period, the main Dalit protest, Dalit politics, was being sustained by two large Dalit peasant groups, the Namashudras and the Rajbangshis. And both these two large peasant groups were significantly affected by partition. The Rajbangshi the habitat was divided down the middle by Radcliffe Line. Part of it went to Pakistan, part of it remained in India. And the entire habitat of the Namashudras went to East Pakistan. If you look at the leadership structure of the Dalit movement, Scheduled Caste Federation movement in before 1947, majority of these people, majority, I would say very large majority of these people were coming from these two groups. And of these two groups, the Namashudras remained in Pakistan. They did not immediately migrate to India because they did not have the wherewithal to do that. They did not have the resources to do that. I'm not going into that issue right now. And the Rajbangshis were also weakened. Namashudra movement was divided, where the Rajbangshi movement went into another significant area, because as a result of partition, the migration to the North Bengal, where the Rajbangshis had major state habitat, there were also non-Dalit, significant amount of non-Dalit Savarna migration to the North Bengal area. As a result of this, Rajbangshis were losing their hold on land and resources, and this led to the rechanneling of the Rajbangshi movement into what we know today as the Kamtapur movement, which was a regional sons of the soil kind of movement, which demanded a separate province of Uttarakhand, or later on the state of Kamtapur, and or a plea for union territory status for Greater Kuch Bihar, and so on. Now, so in other words, those who could support this movement, they lost their spatial anchorage. And what is also most important, many of them, when the Namashudras eventually migrated to West Bengal in India after the 1950 riot, their major concern was to have meaningful rehabilitation in West Bengal and in India. They were all put in the refugee camps where they lived in absolute appalling conditions. And their major focus was now on the refugee movements to demand meaningful rehabilitation, to demand proper citizenship rights. So in other words, their demand for caste equity was now transformed into a demand for citizenship and rehabilitation, one has to remember the refugee protest movement in the 1960s. The majority of the refugees, more than 70% of the refugees in these camps who protested against this, were uh, did belong to the Namashudra community. So, in other words, the Namashudras' fight for caste equality was now being fought in the fight for rehabilitation and citizenship. So, caste movement protest took a different form, and we must not lose sight of that. The other question which remained, that there's another argument, is the issue of the left regime during this period, that it is argued that left rule by sorry, bringing in land reforms like the Operation Barga or the Panchayati Raj kind of altered the caste class equation in the rural West Bengal. It has been now shown that there are several arguments about this. Some of the Dutch scholars would argue, like and Dutch and Norwegian scholars like Arild Rudd would argue that yes, the Borga system did alter the situation, but not to a very large, significant extent that it could change the social hierarchy as such. On the other hand, it brought in some of the Bagdis into the Panchayati Raj. They were appropriated into the system, but they were appropriated only at the bottom of the leadership hierarchy, never could rise up there, up above the bottom ranks of the leadership. And on the other hand, there is also the argument that the left rule brought in the party society, party-oriented society, which displaced the power of all other social institutions and in a way suppressed all other discordant voices. And there was the major argument which the left front put in, that in West Bengal after 1977, class had effectively replaced caste in West Bengal society. And when Mandal Commission was kind of interrogating them, inquiring about the situation of the OBCs, and the West Bengal government, particularly the CPIM's major argument was that the caste did not matter, it was class, and the whole issue of development was approached from that class attitude. What happened as a result? We know now that class and caste operated at tandem, but also in relation to each other. Change of one aspect did not necessarily lead to the change in the other aspect of social relationship. But by suppressing all discussion, all debates about the caste hierarchy, the caste discrimination, it created a situation where we have this very powerful political myth that caste does not work. I've taken a lot of time. I'll end by pointing out another kind of possibility which political scientist Ranovich Samadar has indicated in one of his articles in Economic and Political Weekly. He has alerted us to an alternative way of looking at Dalit politics in post-independence West Bengal. In his opinion, West Bengal witnessed the emergence of a different kind of Bahujan Samaj, where Dalit and Adivasi peasants have combined from time to time on class issues to confront the development state. As examples, one could mention the Naxalbari movement or the Lalgar movement in recent years. The more recent emergence, one could argue that the Mutua Mahasangha, as an organized political voice of the Dalit in electoral politics since 2009, is yet another alternative possibility of Dalit mobilization in contemporary West Bengal. So, in other words, caste did not disappear after partition from West Bengal, but protest against caste kind of got expression through other forms of movements, but we need not really lose sight of the fact that the majority of the people who were participating in those protest movements, like the refugee movements, like the Lalgar movement or the Mutua Mahasangha's participation, that participation is coming mainly from the Dalit groups of West Bengal. So, with those words, I'll stop. I'll possibly have taken more time than I should have, but I'll be happy to respond to any question or criticism or any other comments and suggestions. Thank you very much.
So thank you, sir. And with that, of course, we will open up this session to comments from our colleagues. But if I can just make the opening remarks on that, sir, and that would be that the last portion where you actually start talking about the left, sir, and as you say that caste did not disappear, but perhaps the you know, if I may say, has the discourse on caste disappeared somewhere, sir? Because where I feel that I, as a working on this area, found that Dandakaranya there is an absolute silence on it. Or Andamans, there, most of the refugees who went over there were again the lower caste. Is it true that we were closing the doors of Calcutta to the refugees coming from a lower caste background? And after that we are silencing. I mean, there is hardly research which focuses on what happens, and there is some way a merger that it's a refugee movement. But as I see, and perhaps which you were trying to also hint, is that the caste themselves, the refugees, were more directed towards the rehabilitation program rather than about caste. But somewhere I think there is a silencing then of the discourse also, that these from the scholars as well, to raise the issue that this has been the group which has been perhaps lagging behind in the rehabilitation. So that is my comments. But would you like to take from the others as
I
well?
can respond to your comment first
Right, sir.
and then go
Right.
to other questions. Yes,
Right.
uh, you're absolutely right. And there, our interest, research interests converge.
Yes, sir.
You're absolutely right that in the refugee movement, the caste discourse was very deliberately suppressed. I have seen documents when Jogendranath Mandal started his own organization, East India Refugee Council, which was mostly for the scheduled caste refugees, the Namshudra refugees in the refugee camps. He was attacked again and again from by the left leaders of the UCRC, United Council for uh, United Community for Refugee Councils, or the other way around, UCRC, that he was dividing the refugee movement. I have seen documents when Mandal was asking a camp supervisor that when the West Bengal government recruited drivers from the Coopers camp, where the majority of the inhabitants were Namashudra refugees, how many Namashudras had been actually recruited? And for just asking that question, raising that caste issue, he was chastised as a casteist, as a divisive kind of influence, and so on. So, in other words, refugee movement had its own dynamics as it came under the influence of the leftist political parties from around 1950 onwards, and as the Namashudras began to come to the West Bengal side. On the other hand, the Namashudra refugees who were fighting for their survival through these refugee movements also accepted that. In the sense, they also kind of could see that in order to have their movement effective, in order to reach the government, to make any ripple, they needed the mediation of the established opposition political parties. And it is because of that compulsion that they needed the mediation and support of the established opposition parties, they kind of tacitly agreed to not raise the caste question. So, as I was mentioning, that by deliberately suppressing the caste issue, one of the kind of adverse impact of this whole left politics was that this caste issue has been driven under the carpet. We have not discussed it. And since we have not discussed it, we have not been able to address it to rectify it. So, yes, you are absolutely right. There are some questions.
Pallavi, you are unmuted.
Pallavi, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm sorry. So I was saying that I see the two hands raised here. May I request you to please turn on your audio and video first? Let's go with Mr. I don't know, Sai Thakur. Can you've raised your hand?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for this very insightful, um, lecture on how caste is still important in West Bengal. Partly, I think you have answered this question when you were answering, Professor Pallavi's question. But I'll still, kind of would like to, bring your notice is that, why was caste discourse or discussion suppressed? Was it just because of this historical reasons, like the partition and how it kind of led to a situation where other issues became more important than the caste? How I think there is something more than that, perhaps. There is something very unique about Bengal. I feel sometimes that the upper caste were able to suppress this kind of discussion. Was it because of the immense power that the Bengali Bhadralok had? I think there is something very extraordinary about West Bengal. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you are quite spot on. The extraordinary power of the Bhadralok over the political system and the social system has been developing since the late 19th century, and particularly from the 20th century. And this has not been recognized so far by the scholars. And I remember about 50 years ago when John Broomfield or Cambridge historians were mentioning about the Bhadralok power and the exclusiveness of the Bhadralok power, they were being kind of criticized for looking at only the divisive aspects of society. Now, why this is? I mean, this suppression of the caste discourse has a long history. It starts from the 19th century when I mentioned one scholar, Jogendranath Bhattacharya, who was kind of trying to sell the idea that the caste system was not as divisive as the Western observers were making it out to be. And all the social reformers in Bengal, they were, I mean, this is what I mentioned very briefly as what I call the contradiction of the Bengali modernity, and or the ambivalence of the Bengali modernity. On the one hand, they wanted liberal social reform, but on the other hand, they were silent about the caste system because they wanted to entrench their own privilege, their own entitlement in society, and they did not really like that, and like to face competition from the new entrants into that. So, and we have now historical kind of evidence to establish that. On the other hand, there was another discourse going on. This is another aspect of Bengali modernity. That number of scholars and number of social reformers, very notable intellectuals, began to argue that caste needs to remain, that caste is a unique marker of Indian identity. Because this is something, this is a social organization which you will not find anywhere in the world. It is not as divisive. And also there was the idea that if you dissolve caste system, then you dissolve the entire Hindu society. And entire Hindu society, it's like a kind of chain. If you break one particle of the chain, the entire chain will break, and the whole society will just fall down. So, in other words, there was this idea of discipline, this idea of caste being a marker of social status, social hierarchy, where even the highest educated would go, if a Brahmin would have his son go through the Upanayan or the sacred thread ceremony and so on. And what happened, unfortunately, is that the left rule also kind of, leftism also kind of endorsed or strengthened this whole trend by arguing that 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 is the same modernist argument that if modernity comes in, if industrialization takes place, if land reforms takes place, if these poor people, their real problem was poverty, if these poor people can move up the social scale, their social situation would improve automatically. And what Marxist scholars like R.P. Dutt once had predicted, that when modernization comes, these social hierarchies would collapse automatically. So, in other words, over a very long period, there was a discourse which developed in the Bengal literary society, in Bengal upper caste society, which kind of tried to suppress the discussion of caste while maintaining caste as a normative system determining social status, religious rituals, and so on in their own society. And this is what, I mean, if you look at my 2004 book, Caste, Culture, and Hegemony in Colonial Bengal, this is what I tried to argue was the contradictions or ambivalence of the Bengali modernity, which has not been able to address properly the caste question. And this was kind of reinforced by the compulsions of partition and the weakening of the communities who were protesting against this discriminatory system before independence and partition. So it's a very complex process, various forces reinforcing this kind of forcible silencing of the caste discourse in West Bengal.
Thank you, sir.
But I think now number of scholars, younger scholars like Dr. Chakraborty are recognizing this, and I can assure that a number of young scholars are working on these issues, and I'm sure in next few years there will be a lot of publications which will come up showing how this discriminatory system worked and why was this discourse suppressed and how was it suppressed.
So, our next question is from Divya. Please turn on your audio and video.
Thank you, Professor Pallavi. Good afternoon, sir. I'm Divya. I'm doing my PhD in political science at Delhi University, and I'm working on in the area of anti-caste politics in Tamil Nadu. Sir had given a very brief overview of the development of the caste question and caste resistance in Bengal. While doing so, you had thrown a very important attention to the fact that there has been like portions of resistance from the Dalit community within Bengal in terms of their participation in Naxalbari movement, Largar movement, in terms of their resistance to issues of citizenship and refugee question. But what I find missing in terms of this kind of an understanding is that, so there has been an absence of their protest against the Bengali Bhadrulok, against the issue of caste. Yes, they have been participants within these different forms of movements, attuned to the issues of state, statelessness, or development politics, or the question of refugees and asylum issues, or regional disparities. But what has been missing is the kind of anti-caste resistance or Dalit resistance that we have seen in Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu. That is what has been missing in West Bengal. There has been resistance by the concerned groups, but the resistance towards the caste question, towards the caste issue against the Bengali Bhadrulok elites has been missing from the concerned communities. I wanted you to put some more views, perspectives on that, sir.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that some of these movements are not against the caste question very directly.
Yes.
So I mentioned that as a possibility, which Ranavir Samadar has now pointed out in one of his article, that this is a kind of possibility which one can look at. But the refugee movement is not directly guided or focused on the caste question. I agree with that. But my explanation for that, for the refugees, and as I mentioned, in some of these refugee camps, 70 to 80% of the refugees belong to the Dalit communities. They wanted to raise the caste question, but they could not. And they did not because it was at that moment of time a question of survival.
Hmm.
It was a question of survival, and I would say their strategic consideration was that they had to earn rehabilitation and citizenship, and as a result of that, they have to organize refugee movement with the support of the established political parties. And this has happened again and again in Bengal politics. Whenever the autonomous Dalit movements have sought support of the mainstream political parties, the main caste issue has been suppressed. And these groups, these movements have been appropriated by the mainstream movement. This has happened again and again. And so, in other words, it's even the Naxalbari and the Lalgarh movement, these are situational movement. Within that particular situation, certain movements developed under certain ideological influences, and those ideological influences, which were obviously coming from outside, those ideological influences kept the caste question outside it. And so this has been happened again and again. What has not happened, unlike Tamil Nadu, any autonomous movement arising at a large level from the Dalit groups or the other OBC groups, like the movements that you have, non-Brahmin movement in Tamil Nadu or the non-Brahmin movement in Maharashtra, that kind of movement did not happen. It happened in Bengal. It happened in regionally defined areas, and those regions, this space. I mean, that's another argument of mine, that while looking at Dalit movement, we do not look at the significance of space um, at, in the development of this movement. If we look at the Dalit movement in West Bengal, the significance of space was huge because these groups were located in a very contiguous region. Namashudras lived in 6 districts of Eastern Bengal. The Rajbangshis lived in 5 or 6 districts of North Bengal. So this kind of gave them the spatial ability to mobilize, socially mobilize. And partition took away that spatial anchorage for them. So when the Namashudra refugees came to West Bengal, they were absolutely rootless people. They did not have a space which they could call their homeland. So in other words, it's a very complicated issue. Why the Dalit movements or movements in which significant participation came from the Dalit group did not, or I would say could not, highlight the caste issue itself.
Perhaps we can even look at this way, sir. When they were actually protesting against the issue of citizenship, these were the people who were actually excluded, marginalized from social citizenship.
Hmm, hmm,
So their concerns
yeah,
were equalized in that way.
yes, yeah. I mean, even I mentioned Mutua Mahasangha. Mutua Mahasangha is now kind of aligning with BJP in the sense that this citizenship register would give them citizenship because these were refugees, so their citizenship status would be formalized in the NRC.
Thank you, sir.
But at the same time, they do not consider the other kind of implications of the NRC. and their own position within the Hindu society.
Right. So there are also a couple of chats. I'm following the sequence in which they have appeared. So I'm reading out the question which is there in the chat box. Ishika Makan. So her question is that what led to the possibility of lower caste to enter the Bhadralok sect, and how does it become an exception?
Now, both for the 19th century, when the Bhadralok community was emerging, both S.N. Mukherjee and John Maguire has shown that for a lower caste person, it was possible to enter the charm circle of the Bhadralok, because the Bhadralok defined the status mainly in terms of education. But the problem was, as I said, that the Bhadralok did not always want competition and people coming into their circles so quickly or so often. So, in other words, even when a Bhadralok entered, a lower caste person entered the Bhadralok circle, they had to face various kinds of passive discrimination. They were reminded every now and then what their real caste status was. I would give you just one example. Rai Saheb Ponchanun Burma, who was one of the major leaders of the Rajbongshi movement, and he was a trained lawyer, and he used to practice in Kujbihar court. One day in the court, he had forgotten to bring his that cloak of a lawyer which he had to wear. So he borrowed the lawyer's gown from another colleague. The colleague gave him the gown, but later on, Burma found that his colleague never reused that particular gown. So, in other words, although he was accepted in the community of Bhadralok, he was reminded where he belonged. And that is the ultimate glass ceiling, where even someone entered the charm circle of Bhadralok, surpassing all the kind of the hard uh, doors that they had to open. In spite of that, that glass ceiling still remained to make them an exception. And I have many instances which are coming out in Dalit literature in Bengali these days, many instances how that glass ceiling still works even in the 21st century.
Uh, the next question is by Dr. Dharitri. She's our colleague here at AUD. Dharitri, you want to ask, or should I read out your question?
Pallavi, thank you. Though I have typed it out. Thank you,
Yes.
Professor Bandyopadhyaya. It was really very insightful lecture. And I have a very small question. You talked about homogenization of caste. Uh, uh, that homogenization, of course, one can understand that how this impression is created that there is caste homogeneity, and that is, I understand, is for safeguarding the interest of the upper caste, which historically we can see the way it has happened. On the other hand, I was just curious to know whether the heterogeneity, especially within the upper caste, is recognized and how is it practiced. Uh, um, I just wanted to have some sense of that. If you could briefly just throw some
Could
light
you
on that.
could you elaborate the second part of your question a little bit?
You talked about a heterogeneity, that we should not look at caste as a homogeneous element, but there is a lot of heterogeneity within caste. While one can understand this heterogeneity when we are looking at different caste categories, but within the upper caste, how this heterogeneity works, whether it is recognized and how is it practiced?
Yep. Now, in a way, the popular discourse on caste always kind of assumes some kind of homogeneity. And this homogeneity is in terms of, particularly when it comes to Dalit movement, it is kind of thought that all Dalit groups or all members of particular Dalit castes think in the same way, participate in the same movement, their political ideologies are the same, and that goes on. And this I would say that this assumption, the popular assumption of homogeneity, and this is a rather simplification of the situation, and which does not really help us understand the dynamics, inner dynamics of these movements. But I would say that the same thing does not work in the same way for the upper caste, the conceptualization of the upper castes, because upper castes are always assumed in popular parlance as heterogeneous groups. Upper castes are never assumed to be homogeneous, and it is always thought that in upper caste there's a lot of class divisions, there's a lot of other kind of regional and linguistics and social divisions, other kind of social divisions, so on. But the homogeneity is assumed for the Dalit groups, particularly because their homogeneity comes from the shared experience of exclusion from social privileges. There could be variations of degree, but the basic fact is exclusion. The common factor is exclusion from rights and privileges and entitlements, so on. And because of that basic commonality, it is often assumed that the Dalit groups or other lower caste groups are kind of homogeneous. But that kind of common denominator does not really work while we conceptualize or when we talk about the upper caste groups, where we always think of its heterogeneity, and the upper caste works as heterogeneous groups. Even in the Bhadralok community, S.N. Mukherjee was the first historian who talked about the Bhadralok. He kind of divided the Bhadralok in several categories. The Abhijata Bhadralok and the lower middle Bhadralok and so on. So even within the Bhadralok, there are kind of hierarchies, there are kind of stratification, which is always there in both historical analytical framework as well as in popular assumptions of this group.
Uh,
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I'll go back to now to the hands which have been raised. So, Dr. Benel Biswas is also our colleague here in AUD. Benel, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Hello, Professor. It's always a very enriching experience hearing you speak, and I think I would share. I share the research interest that you had, and your works have been illuminating in the work. And Pallavi, and of course, in all your responses, a few minutes back, you've already focused. So I work on specifically. I also focus on Navashudra, but then I try and look at the cultural discourses, their ways through aesthetic, trying to create a popular historiography, trying to recreate nuances. And you spoke about how literatures were thinking. So I think one portion of my questions were taken care of when you responded to the queries. I was specifically also interested in the last response to the last question. You were thinking about, you were saying there was a lack of homeland, and the way in the north the Rajbongshis created Kamtapuri. I was reading a little bit about the Bongo Bhumi movement, about the district. Not much of it is available. Would you want to gloss over that what happened with the Bongo Bhumi movement? And yeah, could you help us with that a bit?
I really don't know much about that movement. My major study is on the Namashudras and partly on the Rajbongshis. But what happened in the case of Namashudras, they're a community which lived in a very contiguous region, 6 districts of Eastern Bengal, and they are now scattered all over South Asia. They have been sent to Andaman Islands. They have been sent to Dandakaranya. In the Dandakaranya region, they are in Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and some of them are in West Bengal, and some of them have stayed back in Bangladesh. So a community which was kind of concentrated in 6 districts now are spread over across the whole South Asian subcontinent, and their sense of homeland is in the process of remaking. That's at least it was until I studied them. That is the end of 1950s, when they were still trying to rediscover their sense of homeland. Now I believe the Motua Mahasangha in a way has done it. And Motua Mahasangha, by kind of linking up all these scattered people across the subcontinent, have created a new kind of virtual spiritual space in which, and a sense of homeliness, by bringing them together into one organization. And but other than that, and that was my argument. And in 1950, that was their main predicament. That was their main mental crisis, and that was that which they were trying to solve. And all the Dalit writings in recent years that I read focus on that post-partition kind of experience, and that still works as a trauma, that still works as a reference point for the identity formation and their the post-partition kind of social existence. And in case of Rajbanshis, it was completely different experience, because the migration into North Bengal was very of a much different kind. In North Bengal, there was a huge amount of migration of caste Hindus from East Bengal, in East Pakistan, into North Bengal. There was also migration of non-Bengalis from other parts of India, from Rajasthan and other parts of West Bengal into North Bengal. As a result, very soon after the partition, the Rajbanshis felt themselves overwhelmed by the outsiders. And this kind of created a kind of sons of the soil movement. This is also important to follow. When their social movement initially started, they wanted to give up their Koch background. The Koch tribal background had a history of state formation. They had a king who ruled over this region, but they wanted to give up that Koch history of state formation. But now they go back to that. They kind of combine the Koch Rajbangshi identity and invoke that Koch history of state formation, and they kind of demand a homeland in the Kamtapur and so on. So it's a very complicated, but the Bangabhumi Andolan, I don't really know much about it, and so I cannot go into it.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks.
Right. May I ask Dr. Vinod to put across his comments? Dr. Vinod is also our faculty here, I think, at AUD. If you can turn on your audio and video, I'll get to know.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Sekhar. It was a pleasure listening to you. Although I come from a psychology background, but I was very cued into your question. So it is not a historically, textual and narrative question, but I'm just wanting to understand what is, allowing this homogeneity of the Badrlok. In these two images, one is about Tagore, and the other is about this Durga Puja celebration. In the sense, there is something which is bringing the community together at one go, but is maintaining this stark, binaries very sharply. So it's a very it's not within in your narrative, but it is like a free floating question that evokes that kind of psychic intellectual superiority, but also it at the very basic level, uh, you actually to do away with the binaries. No, so there is something about the woman being worshipped, the patriarchy at the feet, but yet it is practiced in a very sophisticated manner, as you said that the lower down the hierarchy imitated the same patriarchal models. So is there any which it's not a question within your presentation, but any thoughts around how do these two iconic, it's like some kind of an iconic idealization, but never allowing itself to be critiqued of its most basic elements that they also don't want to see in those images. So one is sacred, other is intellectually liberal, westernized, and whatever, epitomized in many ways. And also representation of art, classic music, everything comes there, like at one go in these two images. So I was just wondering if there's any thoughts and looking for some images of the sacred of the Dalit within the Western West Bengal framework. What is there a journey of the sacred of the Dalit in the West Bengal framework different from other than Ambedkar? How, because in all the analysis I've heard is that their own divisiveness, partly because of partition and dislocation you mentioned in your lecture. So I was hearing division all the time in all their little movements. But I was just wondering, what if we analyze what was binding together of the Badrlok that also maintained the hierarchy? There must be something that must be binding. There must be something that must be allowing them to hide easily. Also, there is something. I don't know. So this is not a well thought question, but it's just listening to what you've been speaking. This was I just wanting to think. Just hear your thoughts, if there's any. Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting question. Frankly speaking, I have not thought so much about the contemporary Bhadralok psyche as such, but I completely agree that Rabindranath and Durga Puja are the two iconic things which bring the Bengalis, not just Bhadralok and the non-Bhadralok, all the elements together. Tagore is I think I can try to get into this way, but it will not be a very satisfactory answer, I know. This iconic position of Tagore is a much more recent phenomenon. During Tagore's lifetime, he had many critics. During Tagore's lifetime, he was not aware of this Dalit movements and so on. Tagore himself was very defensive of the caste system. I mean, that contradiction of Bengali modernity that I was mentioning, that was very much in Tagore. And I have an article on that, which was published quite some years ago, showing the contradictions in Tagore's writings. On the one hand, he was talking about a unified and universalist nation. On the other hand, he was not really addressing the caste system. He was, like the Gandhian position, he was criticizing the untouchability aspect of it, but accepting caste as a better alternative to Western racial discrimination that goes on. And during his lifetime, he was criticized by various people, various groups. It is only in recent years that he has become an iconic figure, because I think Bengali Bhadralok's insistence on cultural superiority and that kind of works. As of Durga Puja, I have another interpretation of that, and from the other angle of the whole situation. If you look at the history of Durga Puja in the colonial period, for example, if you go back, Durga Puja had various forms. Durga Puja was performed in the zamindari houses. Durga Puja was performed in upper caste villages. Durga Puja was also performed among the Dalits in the Dalit villages. And Dalit religiosity, I would argue, Dalit religiosity cannot be comprehended within the structural binary of Hindu, non-Hindu division. It was a kind of ambiguous space. where all kinds of influences were coming in. On the one hand, we have the dominant Brahminical Hinduism, which was dominating society. On the other hand, we have the local divine sects, which I mentioned, which were particularly developing among the Dalit groups, like the Kotavajas and the Motuas and Shahib Dhanis. These were all led by uh, Dalit gurus. So there was this heterogeneity, and there was this uh, uh, kind of cosmopolitanism and in the Dalit religious world. So it cannot be conceptualized within a structural Hindu non-Hindu binary. Just I'll give you an example. One of the major religious sect which developed among the Namashudras of East Bengal is the Motua sect. And the major guru who popularized the Motua sect was Thakur Guruchand. Now, his grandson, Pia Thakur, has written an autobiography. And in this autobiography, he describes the religious life in his household during his grandfather's time. And in this autobiography, he writes that all kinds of religious functions happened in his household. Some were Vaishnavized, some were the local, coming from the local Peer tradition of the villages. And he also mentioned that Durga Puja was held in their household. But it was a different kind of Durga Puja. It was a Durga Puja where Brahmin priest had no role. It was a Durga Puja where all kinds of people, including Muslims, were invited to have the prasad. So, in other words, you have Durga Puja, but the Durga Puja is performed in myriad ways. And that kind of that plurality brings all this, I believe, brings all these various groups together. In Dalit villages, I have read another autobiography by a Dalit writer who writes that in his village also Durga Puja was performed, but there was no Brahmin Pandit. They themselves offered the puja, and they had all kinds of sporting event like the rowing competition and so on. So from his writings, what comes out that this carnival atmosphere of the Durga Puja was more important than the religious ritual aspect of Brahminical Hinduism. So, in other words, what I say, and now Durga Puja has been politicized. Durga Puja is more in West Bengal. I can see it's more as a political ritual. All the political parties are involved. The commercial firms are involved. Lots of money is involved. And it creates a carnivalesque spirit. I wonder how much it is religious and how much it is just a social interaction and social issue. So I would argue that it is this plurality of the experience which brings all these people together. Maybe this is just an impromptu attempt to think, but it's a very, very important question that we have to think about.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Pallavi. Yeah.
Pallavi, you're muted.
Sorry. So I'm coming back to the chat boxes before we come to Tanuja, Professor Tanuja again. So Manendra Kumar is asking about a refugee colony in West Champaran district, about when and where did it come up here, and is there any study about social identity around this colony in West Champaran? Would you like to take that, sir?
Yes, just very quickly, from 1950 onwards, when the particularly peasant refugees started coming in from East Pakistan into West Bengal, they were first kept in transit camps in West Bengal, and then they were resettled, first of all, in some of the neighboring states, mainly Bihar and Orissa. So it was around in the early 1950s that they were sent. I do not know anyone who have studied the identity aspect of these refugees in Bihar, but I suspect and I think it should be a very interesting topic to research on, because initial reports that we have seen, that I have seen, shows that they had the initial problem of kind of acclimatizing themselves to the both the physical environment as well as the cultural environment, the linguistic difference, and negotiating the linguistic difference, and interacting with the local people, and so on. So there have been some studies on the Dandakaran camps, but I have not seen so far. Pallavi might be able to respond to that, but I have not seen any study looking at the refugees who were settled in Bihar, particularly.
That's true, sir. Bihar has been an underworked area. You're right, absolutely there, sir.
Mm.
The next would be again comment. I think it is something which you have already addressed by Divyani Motla, which she is talking about the homogeneity, heterogeneity question and how it has something to do with the knowledge production. But I think you have already addressed this. Would you still like to make any comments on this?
Yes, I completely agree that that who produces the knowledge is very important. And as I said, that there is a kind of assumption both at popular level as well as a scholarly level at one time, which kind of assumed homogeneity of the Bahujan Dalit. But now the Dalit themselves are writing. In West Bengal, Dalit literature is coming up in a significant way. Number of Dalit scholars are writing their own memoirs and their own autobiographies and their own social and political treatises, and where they are identifying all these various aspects of it, and there is an internal debate developing, as I see. um, and but as you have mentioned, that what despite all these references to heterogeneity, what really brings in their experience at one platform is the shared experience of exclusion. And that also is coming out very clearly from Dalit writings in recent years. So yes, I mean, the knowledge production obviously is very important. Until 1990, no one really wrote about them, particularly in West Bengal. But now a significant literature is coming up. As I mentioned, I know a lot of studies are being done, and some of them by Dalit young scholars themselves. And I'm hoping more and more details will come up in next few years.
Right, so I think we are left with three more last three questions. So Dr. Ritu Sinha is also our colleague here at Ambedkar University Sociology Department. So she has mentioned a question here, but Ritu, do you want to ask or should I read out the question? Okay, so it is about the linkages between caste and class, sir. And so is it casteless Bengal being, dominant discourse without any empirical evidence? I think the relation between the caste and how it is being subsumed under class in case of Bengal, perhaps that is what Dr. Sinha wants to ask.
My own reading of the Bengali social situation in historical period is that caste and class sometimes converge, but sometimes also diverge. Often castes are divided along class lines. Often members of the same caste find themselves on one side of the class divide. And while studying the Namashudra movement, I kind of argued that where this convergence happens, we have an articulate social movement where This convergence leads to divergence. The social movement weakens. When in the early period of the Namashudra movement, we had both the Namashudra rich peasants and the Namashudra sharecroppers uniting against the high caste Hindu landlords. We had several peasant movements, several articulate movements in the East Bengal countryside over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But by 1940s, this unity was being kind of disrupted by various factors where the leaders and their followers, the peasant followers, and the middle class leadership, the elite leadership within the Dalit group, kind of diverging in their aspirations, in their understanding of the social situations, and so on. So, in other words, caste and class, as to put it very in one sentence, caste and class can converge at certain points, but they can also diverge in other situation and in other points. And the whole idea of dominant Bhadralok discourse, um, as I said, I mean, it was not without certain amount of empirical evidence, but that evidence very clearly showed that the Bhadralok was not homogeneous, but the Bhadralok, but the, as I said, the historians have pointed out stratification within the Bhadralok community from the very beginning onwards, but at the same time have argued that a dominant discourse or a discourse of dominance was being universalized from the late 19th century.
Right. So, thank you, sir. And there's
Thank
also
you,
actually
Pallavi.
Ritu's here. Ritu's here.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for responding to this. I uh, also wanted to add a very insightful response, of course, and the talk entirely. Um, just the thing that is it. Do you? I mean, I'm maybe citing the obvious, but a historical input would be certainly, expanding multiple worldviews, is the fact that is it so that these this, if there's a certain posture of Bengal being a casteless society, or suddenly diminishing of the caste altogether, it is so that is it also a political question which is very carefully being intertwined with the cultural?
I would say that this is a very important question, but which needs to be properly studied. As we have seen, as I can see that I'm at the moment editing a collection of essays along with my colleague Tanika Sarkar on caste in Bengal, where we'll be trying to show through various chapters and also our arguments that in Bengal, in the post-independence Bengal, there has been a kind of social political movement to universalize, to normalize the discourse of castelessness. And this became more powerful during the left rule in the West Bengal. And the left front government very consciously, particularly the CPIM, very consciously wanted to promote the idea that it was class that mattered, caste did not. In other words, the whole cultural aspect of caste was completely brushed aside, and the class dynamics of society was put in the forefront. And that was the determining factor in all developmental policies that were taken by the government. And also that was the political position which they took when the Mandal Commission came to inquire about the caste situation in Bengal. And so, in other words, that giving primacy to class over caste, I would say that this was partly the legacy of the left rule that West Bengal had for more than 30 years. But it is also, and some years ago, I kind of tried to make a study, and this is also a response to Dr. Sinha, Ritu Sinha's earlier comment that was this homogeneity about Bhadralok without empirical evidence. To some extent, it was. I mean, when I tried to look at this empirical evidence and the current writings, I could find that there was a lot of writings on how caste works in West Bengal. And but in spite of that, this whole discourse has been normalized. And because many Bengali Bhadralok even today believe that, because they think that is the distinctive marker of their identity. That is where they differ from the rest of India. So it has become part of Bengali identity that caste does not matter, and that is where we are different from India. Whereas, and so this has become a kind of identity, part of an identity politics, identity construction, and that has happened. Although one could argue the the odd Bengali Bhadralok like me would argue that there is a lot of empirical evidence which tell us otherwise, and we cannot ignore it. I mean, I still remember when I started my research in the early 1980s. Um, I was told by many, "Why you are researching this? This does not happen in Bengal." And then I stumbled into piles of documents in archives, which helped me to write not one, not two, but three books on this topic. And I still think there's younger scholars will be writing a lot more about how it works.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Pallavi.
Right. Thank you, sir. And I think we are really taking up a lot of your time as well. But if you can just address the last two
Yeah.
questions which are here, may I go ahead with that? One is from Devanand Kamath, who is our research scholar in this AUD. So he is asking you the relation between nationalist movement, landlord class, and intellectuals, somewhere coming from the background of comparative perspective with Bihar. Would you like to respond to that, sir?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was a very strong correlation between the nationalist movement, landlord class, and the intellectuals in Bengal as well as in Bihar, because most of the Bhadralok had a connection with the landholding, and they were coming from the landed classes. And it was this group who were leading the nationalist movement right from Swadeshi movement through non-cooperation and quit India movement. And that was one of the major reasons why Dalit groups in West Bengal did not participate in any major way in these movements. In Swadeshi movement, they actively resisted the Swadeshi volunteers, who were mostly sons of their zamindars and other petty landlords. They did not cooperate with the non-cooperation movement. They stayed away from the non-cooperation movement. And in the Quit India movement also, we do not have much evidence about their active participation. So yes, one of the major reasons why the Dalit group stayed away from nationalist movement, particularly mass nationalist movement in West Bengal, was this particular reason that the leadership of the Congress were coming from the high caste, landowning, educated groups of Bhadralok in Bengal. Very, very quick answer to your question.
Right. Thank you, sir. And last one before I think Professor Kothiyal will end up the session. So we'll just take this last question from, again, our faculty here in History Department, Dr. Yogesh Snehi, which is about the Muslims in this whole debate. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, Dr. Sneh, this is a very big question. This is a very big question, and particularly it comes to the relationship between Muslims and Dalit in West Bengal, particularly during the colonial period, of about which I know much more than any other period of history in West Bengal, in Bengal area. The relationship between the Dalit and Muslims, I mean, to start with, we all know that the Muslims were gradually going apart from the mainstream nationalist movement. So were the Dalits in West Bengal. And so the relationship between the Muslims and the Dalit was a relationship of both cooperation and competition. It came out very directly from my own study of the Namashudras in peasants in eastern Bengal. The Namashudra mobility, the whole peasant caste was coming up through the social scale with the reclamation of the marshy tracts and the forest areas of eastern Bengal. So as the colonization was taking place, the landowners were mostly upper caste Hindu landlords who were investing in the colonization. But the peasants who were undertaking this colonization were either Muslim or Nomushudras. So what happened as a result? The Muslim peasants and the Nomushudra peasants in the East Bengal countryside were competing with each other for land and resources. But at the same time, their common enemy were the upper caste Hindu zamindars. So we have side by side incidents of rioting between the Muslims and the Nomushudras. We also have incidents of peasant resistance to zamindari oppression, where both Muslim peasants and Nomushudra peasants were uniting against their class enemies. So it's a very complicated relationship, and in broader politics, it becomes even more complicated towards the end when independence and partition was coming, as the Ambedkar's Scheduled Caste Federation, which was led by Jogendranath Mandal, aligned with the Muslim League and supported the Pakistan movement, supported and opposed the Hindu Mahasabha Congress led movement to divide Bengal so that West Bengal can remain in India. So, and Jogendranath Mandal believed that Muslim Dalit kind of alliance was the best way to kind of resist the dominance of the upper caste Hindu Bhadralok. But that did not work after Pakistan was created and Pakistan moved towards more aggressive Islamic nationalism. And Jogendranath Mandal later on was frustrated and he migrated to India with in his letter of resignation, he expresses his frustration that although he believed that through Muslim Dalit alliance he could improve the condition of the scheduled castes of Bengal, but he failed. So it's a very complicated relationship between the Muslim and the Dalit in West Bengal. So it was both a relationship of competition, collaboration, and resistance.
So, um, thank you, sir. That was, we got a lot of information from your own lecture and even more from the question round, and just shows how patiently you have heard and really listened and responded to all of our questions. I say now give it to Professor Tanuja Kotyal, who perhaps also would like to have last comments and to also wind up for you. Thank you, sir, for this being here with us.
Thank you, Pallavi, and thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyaya. It was truly fascinating, and to me, I think what is important, because while you talk about Bengal, I think your lecture and the discussion that we have actually have a wider ramification for a number of intersections that we are talking about, particularly of caste and religion, as we are witnessing it, let's say, not only in Bengal, but as my colleague Yogesh would sort of agree, in the case of the farmers movement in Punjab, where the question of caste and how, where is it subsumed in the religious context is coming up again and again. So on the other hand, like when you mentioned mandal again and again, but there's this other word in our contemporary political context, which is the kamandal, which is about framing a kind of Hinduism which is across caste. So, like, there's also a lot of different kinds of divisions that are emerging, which is very, very, I think it's a very complex reality. And the third category that I would sort of bring in here, particularly because you're talking about the Rajbangshis, is the redefining of the idea of tribe itself. So, say for instance, Rajasthan, where I work, where caste is like very much present in the political social context, where Gujars have been raising the question of tribe and the kingship. I was thinking about Bilendra Banerjee's work on Rajbangshis and the whole idea of kingship itself as it is being brought and reconfigured in the present political context. So I think it's a very, very important historical juncture for Indian society, where these terms may acquire different kinds of meanings sociologically, but as I also think academically, as you are pointing out, in the trajectory of the historiography. I would have loved you to sort of comment on this, but I think like you've been speaking for 2 hours, so I don't think we can take your time anymore.
I'll,
But
I'll just I'll just briefly respond to one point that I could not really cover. One very important point which you mentioned, that's the Hindu mobilization of the Dalit. And I'm sorry it did not come up in that. It did not come up because this is an area which is just being studied. I wrote about it in my 2004 book. There's a one chapter on Hindu mobilization of the Dalit, because there was, from the 1930s onwards, very conscious attempts by Hindu Mahasabha particularly to mobilize the Dalit group, and particularly when Savarkar became the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, this kind of effort was redoubled in the West Bengal area. And what is also very significant, and that is where the question of heterogeneity comes in, when in the 1940s riot, we find many Dalit groups, the peasants, participating in the riot, not just as victims, but also as perpetrators. So, in other words, there's a very significant trend which can be found everywhere in India, and Bengal is no exception.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in Uttar Pradesh, there is a very strong mobilization of what we call the middle caste,
Yeah.
lower but middle caste. And it is turning out to be very, very casteist in its own way, in terms of the, as far as the Mahadalits are concerned, but also, very, very Islamophobic also. So it's, as I say, it's a moment of churn in many, many ways for India, for South Asian societies, and particularly for India, as we are caught in a certain kind of political vortex, I would say. So thank you so much. This has been like really, really extremely instructive and very useful. And I hope we are able to organize, we are able to call you again to our faculty to discuss. And I thank you very much on behalf of the history faculty, on behalf of our university, as well as the History Society, which is largely a student initiative. Thank you very much. And we hope that we will again, call upon you to come and discuss this theme on
Sure.
Another occasion. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. I really thoroughly enjoyed the questions.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's the pleasure's all ours.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Pallavi.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you, sir.
So